Awesome. Okay, everyone, thanks for coming and joining us. I did want to make a quick announcement. If you follow us on our social media and our website, you know that we are beginning a legal blog, which we're super excited about. Part of the legal blog is that we want to write about all of our events, kind of what people thought, like what was your favorite part, any constructive feedback. What did you learn, and what's the most constructive thing you learned? Things like that. It's just a place to archive everything. And then in addition to that, you can write about whatever you want that has to do with the legal sphere. So if you're interested in doing that for this event or future events, or just you have other topics in mind, definitely let us know. You can either email us at vcuprelawsociety@gmail.com or just send us a message that you're interested through Instagram. Yeah, there's multiple ways to get in touch with us. So if you learn a lot from this event and you want to write a blog post about it, please let us know. That would be great. Other than that, I'm just going to hand it over to Laura to get started.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. I recognize a few squares from the other night, but just in case any of you were not at our session on Tuesday night, I will briefly introduce myself. My name is Laura Hosid. I am a private law school and college admissions counselor in the DC area. I went to law school many years ago after undergrad, then practiced law briefly at a couple of law firms in New York and Philadelphia and DC, but then decided that my real passion was working with students and working on campuses. And so I worked for many years doing career services mostly at Georgetown Law School, but also Catholic, Penn, and American. So I've been at a bunch of different law schools working in the career services office, and then started doing private admissions counseling almost 10 years ago, and have also spent a couple semesters at Georgetown undergrad in their pre-law counselor, which resides in their career services office. So I have a lot of experience in the law school world, even though things are changing every year, and especially this year. But most of you, hopefully by the time you apply, things will kind of level out. So Tuesday we talked about resumes, and resumes are one of the main pieces of your application, the others being your transcript, your Lsat score, your letters of recommendation, any addendum, your personal statement, and any other essays that are required. And then there's the interview, which is the topic for tonight. Not every school interviews. So the burden is on you for the schools that you're applying to. It's pretty easy usually to find out on their website whether or not they offer interviews. If a school offers interviews, you should do them. If it's optional, it is a way for them to gauge how interested you are, right? If they offer an interview and you don't take them up on it, that signals to them that either you didn't do your homework and didn't realize they offered them, or you aren't that interested in the school. There are exceptions. There have been, one or two cases where it's just clear that a student really is not going to interview well, and it might do more harm than good. But I would say for most people, you can prepare enough to do a decent interview, and in many cases, it will actually help your application. It's a great way for you to stand out compared to other students who have similar, Lsat scores and GPAs. So always take advantage of the opportunity to interview if it's available. And, I have some students who strategically choose schools that do offer interviews because they know that if they can just get in front of a person, that they're going to be able, they're very good at selling themselves. Interviewing is a skill that many of you have probably already practiced and used in other contexts. And a lot of it overlaps with what you'll need to do in a law school interview, but some of it's a little different. Okay, so starting to go through sort of from the top, the different types of interviews that law schools offer. For those schools that offer them. And this changes year to year too. So if you were poking around and thinking about applying this year, but decided to hold off, I would, double check whatever research you've done, because a school that didn't offer interviews, I predict, although I don't really have a good crystal ball, that, now that it is so much easier, like there used to be an equity issue, right? Like if a school offers on-campus interviews, then it's really, privileging the people who are able to travel to visit. Now that the playing field is kind of level and everybody is interviewing online, I think, what we're seeing at the college level, and I expect to see at the law school level too, is that it's easy to interview on Zoom and it doesn't disadvantage anyone if it's available to everyone. So I think that more schools are going to start incorporating that into their application process. Also, there's a lot of, sometimes there's a suspicion that applications are overly edited by other people, or you've had a lot of help. And, an interview, it's hard to fake an interview, right? Like, someone can help edit your essay, but they can't really interview for you. So it's a way for them to sort of check and make sure that the person actually, matches up with the application. And also, I think test scores are starting to be emphasized a little bit less, partially because it's been so hard to test this year, and just other sort of broader reasons. As you probably know, a lot of law schools have moved towards also accepting the GRE in addition to the Lsat to try to sort of, again, level the playing field a bit. So as certain factors get de-emphasized, then they need to bring in other ways to distinguish between candidates. So interviews, my prediction, you're going to see more of them. The different types of interviews. There are, and some of you may have experienced this when you applied to college, sort of the same thing, like some colleges offered interviews and some didn't. There are alumni interviews. So some schools will give you the opportunity to opt in to be matched with a local alum. Again, if it's on Zoom, it doesn't really matter if it's local, but in pre-pandemic, it would be someone local and you would meet them at a coffee shop or something like that. And, these are usually a little bit less formal and more just a conversation. And also part of it is, the law schools are doing this partially as a marketing ploy as well, right? Because the alum is then selling the law school to you. So it's a way for them to, sort of give a really targeted push for their school to the applicants, in addition for your opportunity to impress them. So alumni interviews are one option, and those are harder to predict because, usually the law school will give the alum some sort of training, and I used to do alumni interviews for my undergrad school, but, you kind of have alumni that take it in different directions. There are some schools, really not that many, but Georgetown is one that comes to mind that is very popular, that offer a group interview, which is a little bit of a weird thing. And it mostly ends up being what I spoke about before, where the admissions people are really kind of trying to sell the school to you, but you do, get a chance to talk as well. Then you have just the sort of more traditional interview with an admissions counselor. And that can be on campus, if and when, not this year, but in normal years, or on Zoom. And these are the ones that I think carry the most weight, because they are with the actual people who are reading and evaluating your application. And, in contrast to alum, these people are a little bit more invested in sort of getting to know you and seeing if you have what they're looking for. So those are typically a little bit more formal. And then something newer that we've seen really only in the past year or two are, different programs where it's sort of asynchronous, like there's no person, like you sign up for a time through a system. There's different systems that do it. And you basically, you hit start and it gives you a question and you have like 30 seconds to think about it. And then it starts recording and you record the answer. And so, the nice thing about this is that you do it on your own time. And from the law school perspective, it's easier for, it's easier for them because there's no actual person doing it. So I think we might start to see more of those as well. I find them a little bit awkward because you're not talking to an actual person, but it's also easier because you get a little bit more prep time, and they usually give you like some practice questions. So that's kind of the universe of different types of interviews. Sometimes they can be, I have had people who have interviewed by phone this year instead of Zoom for whatever reason, which also kind of good and bad, depending on, you know, your comfort level. Like sometimes I think it's better to be face-to-face, but other times it's better that you can like be looking at your notes and pacing around and not be anxious about how you look. So speaking about, I mean, this is just like basic logistics for any type of interview, but, you know, wear something professional, at least the part of you that's going to be visible in the square. And if you are not, if you're wearing like flowered pajama pants, don't stand up and forget that you're wearing flowered pajama pants. You know, make sure you have a background that's not distracting and you're not like doing it in a coffee shop. And you have reliable internet and nobody's going to be interrupting you. And, you know, these are, you know, you guys are in college, so you probably can figure out. My high schoolers, I need to go through this in like painful detail, but you probably have got this under control by now. Wear headphones if you need to wear headphones, that kind of thing. Be on time, be, you know, put it in your calendar, all of that. These are general life lessons, not specific to law school. Okay, so next thing I wanted to talk about is sort of, and this is not a very concrete topic, but sort of like what do interviews mean? Because at some schools they are available to all applicants, and all you have to do is request one. If you would like to interview, you get to interview. And like I said, you know, I would advise you to always take advantage of that. At many schools, though, it's law schools anyway, it's by invitation only. And what that, I mean, you know what that means. It means they decide who they want to interview, and they're not always very transparent about who they decide to give an interview to and who they don't. And there's a lot of speculation out there as to what the interviews mean. And at some schools, you know, you can sort of find all of this on Reddit or wherever your, you know, medium of choice. But for some schools, it means that like, as long as you don't screw it up, you're going to be accepted. At other schools, it's just, they could just kind of pick and choose a cross section of people to interview, and it doesn't necessarily have any bearing on your, you know, or indication about your chances of being accepted. And then, you know, what I've seen at a number of schools is that they deliberately target candidates who are sort of borderline. So, you know, if you're a clear admit based on your academics, you're in one pile. If you're clearly not a good candidate based on your academics, you're in another. And then the people in the middle are the people they decide, well, hey, like maybe if we got a little bit more information from by talking to them, we can, you know, we can, sorry, oh, yes, good. I'm glad you're asking questions. I should have said before, any questions, just feel free to ask as I'm talking. But, you know, if you're borderline, they might decide that more information could be helpful. If they have a specific question, for example, you know, there's something on your resume that raises a red flag, or not even a red flag, you know, maybe, or there's something in your addendum that basically like something specific that they want more information about. I've definitely seen that be something that inspires an interview as well. Okay, question was, can you still ask for an interview if it's normally invitation only? I wouldn't. If it's unclear, then sure. But if you go on a lot of these schools' websites, it will be very clear. Like there will be an FAQ that says, how do we choose? And they'll say, you know, so if they make it clear that it is or not random, but it's invitation only, and, you know, then don't ask, because it will indicate to them that you didn't read the FAQ or read their website. But if it's not clear, then I think it's fine to ask. Is there any way to increase chances of getting an interview? I mean, I think that it can depend on the school, but they're pretty, like I said, they're not very transparent about who they choose to interview. I think that if you are, put pandemic aside, if you are visiting a school, or if you are going to be in the local area, then I think it's appropriate to email the admissions office and say, you know, hey, I'm going to be in the area, whatever dates, I'm planning to come by campus. You can ask to do something like sit in on a class, post-pandemic. And you can say, would there be anyone available for me to meet with when I'm on campus? And so you're not necessarily asking for a formal interview, but if you meet with an admissions officer on campus, I would consider that an interview and treat it as an interview, even if it is not technically called an interview. So I think it's absolutely appropriate to ask to meet with people, or you could also, and this is a strategy at schools that just don't offer interviews also. If you have specific questions about the school, you can contact the admissions office and say, I have a couple of questions. Is there anyone who would be available for a quick, phone call or Zoom call in the next few weeks to answer my questions? Then you have to have some questions, obviously, but that is a good way, one, to get, to sort of make a connection with someone, and whether it's face-to-face or even on the phone, and a really good way to demonstrate interest and to show them that you are, really serious about law school and serious about their school in particular, because they want to admit people who they think are going to come. If they've got two students who are, similar academically, and one they know is really interested and has a good chance of what they call yielding, which yield is how many people accept their offers, that's the person they're going to take. And that's why you see sometimes students who are very highly qualified, who are applying to schools that are well below their sort of academic range. It's called yield protection. Basically, sometimes schools will not admit them, or will waitlist them, or will just sort of take a long time, because basically they're looking at them and they're saying, like, you're not going to come here. You're going to have quote unquote better options. So we're not going to admit you, because then it messes with our yield rate. And you may have experienced some of this in the undergrad world as well. So demonstrated interest is definitely a thing with law schools, and even more so, I know I'm getting a little off track from the interviews, but there's a lot more waitlisting that goes on with the law school process compared to undergrad. Law schools kind of use the waitlist as a tool to manage their yield. So they will let a bunch of, because it's mostly rolling admissions for nearly every law school, they will let candidates they really want in. They will waitlist some. They will just sort of hold off on answering some. And it's just sort of an ongoing process. And then the first deposit is normally due. You can actually, you can look this up. There's a list every year of when the first deposit is due at each school. And when the first deposit is due, then they get a sense of, like, okay, half the people we made offers to didn't submit a deposit. So now we have a whole bunch more spaces. So then they go to their wait list. And it's just a way for them to, like, not let too many people in, not knowing who's going to accept. So and once you get to that wait list stage, then it's getting into the, late spring and into the summer. So at that point, demonstrating interest can really be helpful, because they want to let in people who they know are going to accept, because it moves very quickly at that point. So definitely, go the extra mile, maybe not literally, but, put in some effort to demonstrate some interest if you've been waitlisted. And again, sorry, I will get back to interviews, I promise. But if you are waitlisted, there is such thing called a letter of continued interest. You'll see it, LOCI, which is basically, you send them a letter and you write, hey, my name, whatever, I was recently waitlisted. I wanted to let you know that I remain very interested in your school. And since I submitted my application, I've been doing X, Y, and Z. And, just sort of update them on anything new since your application, but also let them know that you're still interested, so that they, they're keeping tabs on who on the wait list they think has just totally moved on and who is actually genuinely still interested. Okay, is there, post-pandemic, do you think it would be a good idea to ask how the school responded to COVID and what measures they took to keep students safe? I think that's going to be a big factor in sort of how people are judging schools. You know, I don't think it should be the only factor, but I think it's a very valid thing to ask about. And I think, you know, what the leadership of the school does, you know, hopefully there's not going to be another pandemic while you're in law school, but how they treated it and what they, you know, whether they took care of their students, took care of their faculty, took care, you know, what they prioritized, I think does speak volumes about the school. So I think that is a valid question. What are some other things that we can do to demonstrate interest when waitlisted? And within your application? Okay, two good questions. When you're waitlisted, there's, you know, it's visiting, talking to other students. You know, that's a good thing to write in the letter of the letter of continued interest. You can say, oh, you know, I recently spoke to so-and-so who is a current 2L, and he told me about his experience in the XYZ clinic, and that made me even more excited for your school. Again, it just shows you're interested, and it shows that you took the extra effort to talk to some random 2L, whether it's a, you know, connection you made or someone you reached out to. Doesn't really matter who the 2L is. It's just the fact that you're making the effort to do that. Within your application, how to demonstrate interest. First of all, getting your application in as early as possible. Now, there are factors that can, you know, weigh in there, like if you are waiting for an Lsat score, or if you are a senior and you would really benefit from showing your fall senior grades and so want to wait for that. Like, there can be reasons to wait, but in most cases, you want to apply as early as possible, because I think that shows interest and also just increases your chances. Otherwise, within the application, the essay, the personal statement and the essay. So sometimes schools have additional essays that will ask something like, why do you want to go to law school here? Or what do you want, you know, where you can basically write like a why this law school statement. Otherwise, what a lot of students will do, and, you know, I'm mixed on this. It depends on if you have something to say, but basically they'll change the last paragraph of their personal statement that kind of talks about, like, you know, why law school, and they'll swap it for each school. The last paragraph of the personal statement will be a little bit different and will be personalized to that school. And that's definitely something that you can do. Like, logistically, you can do that. You can have a different personal statement for each school. So that is another way to kind of show that you've done your homework and show that you've done your research. And how can we stand out during the interview, which I'm getting to, I promise. That is another way, you know, doing your research about the school. I talk a lot. Okay. That's, you know, you got to have a balance, right? Like, when I do practice interviews with students, I always say, you know, don't just, like, if they say, what's your favorite class in college? And you just say, like, oh, I really liked, you know, philosophy 101. That's not a very good answer. I mean, it answers the question, obviously, but I always say there's an implied why. So, you know, philosophy 101 because, and then, you know, talk about why you liked it. That being said, I think, you know, there is a line that you know, you don't want to then start talking about like all of your other classes. So answer the question with an explanation, and then, you know, a little bit is just sort of reading their cues. Sometimes, honestly, interviewers like it when you talk a lot because it takes the burden off of them. And if they're doing a lot of these back to back, sometimes it's easier to just let the other person talk. But you got to kind of gauge how they are doing. But okay, so let's move on to the actual interviews, and how to stand out and how to demonstrate interest and all of those things. And, you know, I think you should clearly be prepared to answer a couple of basic questions. So number one is going to just be, and they may, you know, they may not ask it explicitly, but they're going to ask it in some way. But why do you want to go to law school? Like, not even so much why this law school, but why in general? Why do you want to go to law school? And, you know, by the time you interview, you probably will have written your personal statement. And so you will have hopefully developed somewhat of a response to this question. Some not good answers that I see a lot. Well, my parents always said that I was really good at arguing, so I always thought I should go to law school. Not a great answer. I have always loved Law and Order and like other legal TV shows. Also not a great answer. You'd be surprised at how many of these I see in a first draft, and then we change it. And then there's sort of the variation of like, well, I don't know what I want to do, and people tell me that a law degree is good for anything. Might be true. That's kind of why I went to law school, but not what I wrote about in my personal statement or what I shared in an interview. So you want to come up with some sort of compelling reason. And for some of you, it's very clear why you want to go to law school. Like, oh, I interned at a policy organization over the summer, and I really saw, the impact that the law had. And so I came back to college and I took a legal studies class, and, there's like a clear narrative as to why you want to go to law school. My dad is a lawyer, and I, have volunteered, I helped out in his office every summer, and I learned this, that, and the other. And, I really want to go. There are a lot of different reasons, so it's hard for me to give you sort of like, this is a great answer, but I think it is an answer that has some substance and, is convincing to them, because, not everybody who applies to law school goes to law school, and not everybody who starts law school finishes law school. So they want to be convinced that you know what you're getting into, basically. So the answer should show an awareness of sort of what law school entails, and possibly what being a lawyer. What if why you want to be a lawyer could also potentially be a turnoff, but it's truthful. Well, I guess it depends on how much of it you're like. Are we talking like you want to help, like your family is in the mob and you want to help them? Or is it just like, oh, I want to be a public defender, and you're worried that like some people might not like that? I think if it's truthful, I think it's fine. I mean, what I would say, and I think I said this about something in the resume workshop, is, if that answer is not, if they don't like that answer, then maybe that's not the right law school for you, right? Like if they, if you want to be a public defender and they find that objectionable for some reason, then that's probably not where you want to go to law school. But, if your family is in the mob and that's why you want to go, you might want to come up with another story. Okay, so what else about why you want to go to law school? There's always a way to favorably present the truth. That is true. Okay, so the other question that's sort of tied into this question, but it gets separated out a lot, is why do you want to go to law school now? And that might be because you're coming directly from undergrad, and they want to know why you want to come directly from undergrad. Or it may be, I could see this question being asked even more when you have taken some time off. Sort of why now? Like, has this always been part of your plan? Or, what, and so the right answer is, or a good answer is not, well, I'm just, I hate my job and I, am ready for something new. Not a good answer, because that's not convincing them that you like genuinely want to be a lawyer and want to be in law school. So those are some things to think about. And then I think behind every question is really this, why should we choose you? Like, what are you going to contribute to? Think about it from their perspective. Like, they want to know, what are you going to contribute to the law school community? What are you going to contribute? Like, what kind of perspective are you going to bring to classroom discussions? If they are interviewing you, in most cases, it means like the interview is not going to get you in if you are not academically qualified to do the work at that school. And it's in most cases not going to keep you out if you are qualified. But I think it can, if they've, especially at the more competitive schools, when they have plenty of people who can do the work there, right? And that's not enough to get you in. Now they're looking at these things like, what are you gonna bring to the classroom discussion? What unique perspectives do you have? And it's fine to repeat things. If you have written a diversity statement, if your personal statement talks about why you want to go to law school, I mean, it would be silly to say don't talk about those things. So I think it's fine to highlight some of the things that are already in your application, because I think it would be weird not to. And again, it goes with that whole idea of you matching with your application. So think about what you can tell them that would distinguish you from other applicants with similar grades and test scores. And so I usually say to go into the interview kind of with a 3-point agenda. So, I mean, have prepared answers for some of the basic questions like why law school, and why this law school. I mean, that's the other thing. You want to really be able to convince them this is where you can demonstrate interest. Like when they say, okay, well, why do you want to go to, why do you want to go to Northwestern? This is your opportunity to show them that you've done your homework and talk about, and don't just say, I want to go, I really want to be in Chicago. Great, there's other law schools in Chicago. So, I mean, that can be part of the answer. Like it can be, I'm from the Midwest and I really envision myself being, but I think there needs to be more to it. Something about the academic programs that they offer, whether it's, particular clinics or journals or anything like public interest programs, something that they offer. But back to the 3-point agenda. So in addition to why do you want to go to law school? Why do you want to go to our law school? Why do you want to go to law school now? I think thinking about like what, if you wanted them to walk away from this interview knowing 3 things about you, what would they be? And this could be things, again, that are highlighted elsewhere in your application, but it could also be things that, for whatever reason, were not easy to convey in your application. And this is a great opportunity to do that. So, say you are just really into philosophy and you read philosophy books and you listen to philosophy podcasts and things like that, but it's not like a formal activity that you were really able to highlight in your resume. Well, that might be one of the things that you think like, I'm gonna, like, no matter what they ask, I'm somehow gonna work it in that I have this random, it's not that random, interest in philosophy. And so, once you have in your mind that you want to talk about that, there's so many questions that they ask where you can kind of work it in. It could even be when you're talking about why you want to go to that school. Well, actually, I have this, I noticed that Northwestern has this really interesting philosophy in the law class, and I was really excited to see that because that's, one of my hobbies, and I was actually just listening to a podcast on the way here. So you can think about ways that you could work that in. And it could be, it could be anything. You just want to pick sort of 3 things that are really unique to you. And I think having those in mind also, and this isn't really a law school specific interview tip, but just sort of having those things in mind make it easier when you kind of have these stories already prepared and in your pocket. And so when they ask a question that's kind of vague, you can pick one of them and try to make the answer work. And for all of these, I would advise, like, whether you practice with someone else beforehand, or I even find it helpful to just write out the answers and absolutely not to read, because if you read off a paper, even if you're on the phone, like if you're reading off a paper, it's clear and it doesn't sound natural at all. But writing it out forces you to articulate it, because, sometimes you'll be like, okay, well, I know why I want to go to law school and I know why I want to go now. Like I can do that. But if you actually sit there and force yourself to write it out, it just helps you kind of organize it and clarify it and have the bullet points in your mind when you have to go actually say it to someone else. Okay. So I would also, think about if there are any blemishes, let's say, on your record that you think might be brought up by them, or it's unusual that you would want to bring it up on your own. But if there's something that you think that they might ask about, I had a student recently where they got a call like late one night, like saying they wanted to, the school wanted to interview them the next morning on the phone. And so this was clearly not this was not like a traditional interview. It didn't even say interview. It just said like, are you available for a phone call tomorrow morning? So the student was panicking, and we were trying to figure out, like, is there something specific that they're calling about? Like, what are they, and so sometimes it is. If you had, you probably, if you've looked at law school applications, like you need to disclose a lot of stuff. Like if you have any sort of speeding tickets from when you were in high school, or like underage drinking citations, or any, and then, obviously people have sometimes more serious things. Just to put you all at ease, they don't really care about speeding tickets or underage drinking citations. But I've definitely had students who have had more serious things on their record that they have had to disclose. And just, I know, sorry, I keep getting off track. I know this isn't what we're talking about, but rule of thumb with those things, just disclose. Better to disclose than to, like, if there's any doubt, put it on there. It is much, much worse if they somehow find out that you had something on your record that you did not disclose, because then it's an honesty issue. But there are things like, I've had students who have had issues with plagiarism, let's say, that's a little dicier because law schools don't really like that. That student did get into law school though, so she's fine. But that's the kind of thing where I would maybe be prepared to be asked about it. And you've probably already given it some thought and written your addendum about it for your application, so it shouldn't be that difficult. Okay, so you also want to have questions for the interviewer, because almost every interview will end with some variation of, do you have any questions for me? And, I've noticed that, like I mentioned earlier, with sometimes interviewers just being a little lazy, that's a good way for them to get to stop talking. So you want to have a bunch of questions, partially because depending on which way the conversation goes, as I mentioned, they're trying to sell you on the school as well. So something that you were planning to ask about may have come up in the interview, and they may have already basically answered the question. And then you clearly cannot ask it. So that's my pitch for always having some extra questions, just as backups. In general, you do not want to ask anything that is very easy and obvious to find on their website. So don't ask how many law students they have, or, just things that you could easily find on the website are not a good use of your questions. So I think there are ways to sort of show you've done your research, like, oh, I was reading about the philosophy in the law class, or whatever clinic, and then ask a question about it. Like, where I was reading about your summer internship program, international summer internship program. Can you give me some examples of some places that, students have interned? So it shows you've done your homework, but also asks a question. And, if you have genuine questions that you want answered, this is a good place to do it. It's almost, it's like a targeted admission session. If it's an alum, remember that, like, an alum isn't always going to have the same answers. I would do alumni interviews, and students would ask me about, like, the engineer, and I'm like, I wasn't an engineer, I have no idea. So admissions officers, you can expect to have a broader range of knowledge than an alum. With an alum, it's always a good backup. Okay, I promise I'm gonna look at the questions in a sec. Always a good backup to just say, what was your favorite professor or class, or like, what is one of your favorite experiences, just sort of ask. And oftentimes the admissions officer may have attended the law school. So you can ask that as well, but people like to talk about their own experiences, and you often learn something from that. Okay, let me look at the questions, sorry. Okay, regarding the addendum, are you supposed to disclose bad grades for every semester if you've had a bad grade every semester or just one really bad term? I think that would depend on, it's hard to say without knowing the details, but, basically anything you want to explain can go in the GPA addendum. So if you just want to say like, as you can see, I've had difficulty with my science courses, so if there's some sort of theme, if you've had a bad grade every semester and it was always in like foreign language or always in science, you can sort of connect them with a theme. Or if there was one really bad term where you had mono or deaf in the family, like that, it just depends on what the explanation is. If it's just didn't study and didn't do well, then there's nothing to say. Okay. Is it okay to ask if there are any parts of my application that are concerning so you can defend yourself? Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's obviously, that could depend on your specific situation. Like if you know that there's something in there, but if your GPA is on the lower side or your LSAT score is on the lower side, like, I think it varies as to how honest they'll be, but sure, if you're confident enough to defend yourself, I think that's great. Okay. Why do you want to, is it appropriate to mention, in addition to other reasons, that this is the best high, I don't think you really want to talk about the rankings. I think they want, they want to know that you're like substantively interested in the school and not focused on the rankings, even though you are. I think it is appropriate to say, this is my first choice school. I think that is something that they like to, don't say if it's not true. Don't say it's a multiple schools. It's, if it's a school that offers early decision, which is when you make a binding commitment, you can say something like, I mean, if you're applying early decision, then that's pretty obvious. But if you're not, you can say, this is my first choice school. However, for financial reasons, I wasn't able to make an early decision commitment, but this is my, this is my top choice. The flip side of that, in those letters of continued interest, if it really is your top choice and you would attend if admitted, like that is a powerful statement to put in that letter. This is my top choice, and if you admit me off the wait list, I will attend. You obviously can't say that to multiple schools. And you can't say that if you're comparing scholarship money. Okay, should we expect a request for an interview if the school is deciding to grant scholarship support? If so, we should expect a different array of questions. I don't think that they're typically not connected. The money typically like that's a kind of separate process, unless it is a specific scholarship that you have applied to. If we're just talking about merit money, that's usually just a kind of separate consideration. Can you share your insight on diversity statements? If you can write a diversity statement, you should. How bad is it if you say, it's not, it's fine. I say it all the time. They know that you're nervous. It's totally fine. And it's also fine to say like, oh, that's a really good question. Can I think about that for me? Just kind of stall a little bit while you think is also fine. But okay, back to the diversity statement. I encourage everybody to write one if you can, because you want to provide as much information as possible. So any chance you have, and that's, same thing with, I mentioned if there's an optional interview, you should do it. A lot of schools have optional additional questions in addition to the personal statement. They are not optional if you want to go to their school, is what I always say. What does it tell them if you can't be bothered to answer their optional questions? Now, the diversity statement is a little bit different because some people just quite frankly have nothing to say. And then you can do more harm than good. If you, really have nothing to say and you try to like put something together that just is very forced, you can do more harm than good. That being said, diversity can mean a lot of things. think about what they're looking for. They are looking for diverse perspectives in the classroom. So there are, I think everybody knows, sort of more traditional racial ethnic diversity, but I have seen some really great diversity statements about things that you wouldn't consider traditional diversity. So, if you've taken a couple of years off, that's, that's usually an easy thing to focus on. If you have, trying to think of ones that I've had students write recently, like a student who grew up in the army. I mean, her dad was in the army, but and it lived in like 10 different places in the US. Like, that brings a unique perspective. A student who was a math or some sort of very, hardcore STEM major, wrote about that and sort of how that brings a different perspective to the legal world. A female student who had taken time off and was working in cybersecurity, whatever it was like a very male-dominated profession. I think she was the only female in her company. Like, she wrote, so it's not just like, okay, I'm a girl. It's, here are my experiences working in a male-dominated profession. So there are a lot of creative ways to think about how you add diversity, add a diversity of perspective. And then clearly, if you have more traditional things to write about, those work too. But like I said, if it's a stretch, don't do it, because there's nothing worse than a forced diversity statement. Okay, I just saw another question. Oh no, that was the one. Okay. Thank you notes. Back to the interview. Thank you notes are always a good thing. Again, general life lesson. You should write a thank you note. You can write an email, it's fine. Short and sweet, and make sure to get their name right. I would send, if it's an email, send it pretty quickly, because there's really no reason for it to take a while. But it can be really short and sweet. Thank you for your time. I really enjoyed, learning more about Northwestern University, and I look forward to hearing from you when you make your decision. Or if if there was something specific that you talked about that you think is worth mentioning, or including, I have a student recently, this was might have been for a college interview, but either way, like, somehow his woodworking hobby came up, and he talked, they said, oh, well, what are you working on? And he talked about this bear he was making. And so in the thank you note, he attached a picture of the bear. And, just little things like that help make a connection, and just at a bare minimum, just a thank you note thanks them for their time and is courteous. Okay, do you have to pick just one diverse perspective, or can you do a combination of things? I've seen both. I mean, I've seen one, but I've seen people successfully combine multiple things. It can sometimes be tricky. Diversity statements are usually only one page, and so if you try to incorporate too many things, you don't get to really go in depth into any one of them and explain how they have shaped the person you are today. So I think it's a little tricky, but sometimes, if you have multiple things, then I'll talk with students, say, okay, well, this you can incorporate into your personal statement, and this you can incorporate into the diversity statement. So there are ways to kind of get all of it in. Or maybe one of the aspects that you wanted to highlight is something that you have gotten very involved in a political campaign or a nonprofit or something. You could get a letter of recommendation from someone who knows you in that context, and that would highlight that aspect. So there's different ways to get things in, and if you have multiple things, that's a good thing. Just my one concern is when you try to, you gloss over too many things if you try to fit them all into one statement, and then you don't really get to dive deep into any of them. Okay, so that was thank you notes. Let's see, that is most of. Does anybody have other questions about interviews specifically? Let's see. All right, I have a question about taking more credits than necessary for an undergraduate degree before receiving that degree to shift your GPA in a positive direction. Yeah, do whatever you can to get your GPA up. I mean, it depends on what the cost is, right? Like if there's a financial or time cost to doing it, then it may not be worth it. But if it just, if it's easy to do, then sure. For better or worse, and mostly worse, law schools are very focused on numbers. They want to be able to report a certain GPA and Lsat score. Do they see through that? I mean, do they see through it? I mean, it depends on how obvious it is. If you're taking like a bunch of random classes through places other than your school, and that's something else I should mention. So your transcript or transcripts have to all go through LSAC. LSAC is the organization that puts out the Lsat. So you sign up for it, you create an Lsat account, and then you sign up for the CAS, which is the Credential Assembly Service. And you have to send all of your transcripts to them. And so if you transferred schools, if you took a summer class at a community college, if you studied abroad, any transcript that you have, well, read the rules. Sometimes you don't have, but in most cases, like everything has to go to them, and then they put it all together and recalculate things and like work their magic, and they send you what like your LSAC GPA is, which sometimes can be different from the GPA you thought you had. So better to do that earlier rather than later, in case there are any issues. So for example, and you can go on their website, like they do different things with, like if you took a class pass fail, which obviously could be more of an issue recently, like LSAC sometimes calculates that differently than your school does. And it might depend on, and if you withdrew from a class, and if you have study abroad grades, like LSAC can do some weird things with those things. So just
Laura, I have a quick question with regard to those credits. My understanding is that LSAC will take all your credits up until your first degree. So the question is usually the first degree is about 110, 120 credits. So if a student wants to stay on for another year and get 30 more credits, that kind of changes, they could change their GPA in a positive direction. I don't know if it's worth the cost, but if it's a student who is less than a 3.0 and trying to get to law school and hopes they can notch it up and perhaps do some kind of degree someplace else. The real question I have, and I get students like this all the time, is should they do it or should they not do it? And I'm really not sure how to give them an answer on that particular question. So I'm actually kind of curious about your insight on this particular issue.
Yeah, so you're saying this would be after they've received their degree? Because yeah, ELSA, they definitely like don't care so much about any graduate classes or graduate degrees even, or GPAs. I would look at the LSAC fine print and see exactly how they're going to calculate it.
All right, so they won't necessarily just take the first 120 credits. They'll take 150 credits if necessary before you get your actual first degree then, or they could.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It might not seem too much like about the interview, but I guess it's more about Georgetown. I went to the info session and they said something about how you're able to submit a video.
Yeah.
And so I guess I was just wondering, in terms of, the types of interviews versus the video, what types of things should you include in the video if you do get an interview? Like how should you,
Yeah, no, the videos, the videos are weird. And I think they're actually, so for Georgetown, there's like a couple of options of essays, and then one of the options is the interview. The video. So if you are not comfortable making a video, you might want to choose one of the other essay prompts, because I think they're kind of presented as equal. So not doing the video, if you do the other prompts, I think is totally fine. And most of my students, I have a lot of students who apply to Georgetown, and most of them have not done the interview, the video, just because it's a lot of pressure to come up with something creative that is going to work there. but I have seen some interesting ones. I had a student who like gave a little tour of her art. She was an artist, and she kind of presented all of her art, but also kind of tied it to her interest in the law. But it's tricky. It's tricky to do because you got to be a little creative. So unless you have a good idea, my advice is to pick one of the other prompts.
Do you know if you can do both?
I think you might be able to. I don't know. I don't remember off the top of my head.
Gotcha. I was just curious.
Yeah. But their prompts are kind of fun. Like I think one of them is about like advice you would have given to your former self or something like that. So I like when the prompts are not your traditional, just like why law school? What do you want to do at our law school? Because it allows you to kind of showcase another part of your personality.
What's the best answer you've heard for why do you want to be a lawyer or why do you want to go to law school?
I think usually it is tied to something academic that the student has done in college, and or some sort of internship or work experience that they've had where they have had some interaction with the law. So whether, as I mentioned, it was, they're at a policy organization and they noticed that like the lawyers were the ones who really, were influencing what was going on. Or, I worked with a student this year who took a lot of classes about like China and like international trade. And so his answer was very focused on sort of exploring that more in depth from a legal perspective. So usually it's sort of tied to something else that they've done. And which makes it an answer that like not everybody could, because if your answer is just, oh, well, I think the law is fascinating. And if it's an answer that somebody else could write the same answer, then it's not great. So something that really kind of hooks on to something that you have done, whether it's academically or outside of the classroom.
So what I'm gathering is choose a specific story and blow that up, like go from there.
Yeah.
Okay. Good tip. Thank you.
Yep. And don't feel like it has to be something totally, you're not going to come up with something totally original. I mean, these law schools, they've seen everything. So don't feel pressure to make it completely unique, but at the same time, if it's something that another student could write, then it's not great. And the flip side is with telling the law schools why you're interested in them, if you could just sub out the name of a different law school, I love your great clinical programs and your LRAP program, then that's also not a great answer.
These interviews used to be pretty rare in the old days, except for some of the top tier schools.
Yeah.
So you think that because of technology and Zoom, we're going to have more of these interviews, even for the second and third tier groups?
I mean, again, I don't have a crystal ball, but it seems like it's so much easier and such a good way for schools to get a little bit more information about students, especially as application numbers are rising. It's just a better, another tool for them to differentiate between students.
I do have another question. So obviously the world has gone through this pandemic, and if let's say, if let's say a student has like a bad semester because of the pandemic, I don't know how, because we've all gone through it, I don't know how common it's going to be for students to say like, oh, it's because of the pandemic. So do you think that if that's the case, like that would be okay to, in like an addendum or in an interview to, say that it's because of the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's hard, right? Because like some students experienced the pandemic and had good grades. So I think you probably need to, they are going to look at it and say, oh, that was 2020 or that, or now 2021, like that, that explains it. But at the same time, if it was something specific, like, oh, I had COVID, or my family, or I had, struggled with virtual learning. It's not a good fit for me, or I didn't have internet, if it's something specific. If it's just, oh, that was 2020 and during the pandemic, I don't think that that's probably worth mentioning.
Quick question. I knew last year when the pandemic was hitting, a lot of students were opting out. And then it seemed kind of surprising that law schools were receiving an increase in number of the people who were applying. And I remember reading that actually the number of applicants for this year is actually higher than it was in past years. And actually the scores of the students is more competitive than the past. So would you expect this to continue to pick up? And is part of the reason why this is happening, in your opinion, because people are transitioning from one approach of life or one career back to law school, or they're thinking that this is the time for major change and it's time to go to law school? Or, how do you account for this rather interesting and I think surprising trend towards people applying for law school?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's law school applications are always cyclical. And when the market is, when the economy is bad, and not that the economy is necessarily bad, but like when the job market is iffy or there's uncertainty, people decide to like, okay, I'm going to kind of wait it out in law school for 3 years, and then the job market will be better or different. So that could be part of it. And, students graduating college and just feeling like, how am I going to start a new job? And what am I, and, that is sounds silly to say it's the safer or easier route, since it is very expensive and 3 years, but in a way, I think some people view it that way. Or there are people who just decide they've kind of taken this time to reassess their lives and decide that this is the path they want to pursue. But there are a lot of people who apply to law school and don't go. A lot of people just kind of want to hedge and I don't know what's going to happen. Let me throw in some applications, and that buys me, 6-9 months to sort of figure this out. So just because applications are up, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be more competitive. And it doesn't mean, people are also, what I'm seeing anyway, or people are just applying to more schools. Because again, there's so much uncertainty and they don't know whether they're going to want to move across the country because they might want to stay closer to home now, or, all kinds of different factors. So they're just applying to more schools, but they can only go to one. So, I do think there's, like I said, the wait lists, everyone's kind of anticipating even more use of wait lists this year because the law schools don't know what's going on either.
And last question. How do you feel about deferring applications? Should students apply and then if they get in, defer, or should they, wait until they're ready to go and then apply?
Wait until you're ready to go. Law schools, it's very interesting. Like undergrad, again, who knows what's changing with the pandemic, but undergrad, typically, you want to defer, you defer, no questions asked, really. Law schools do not like deferrals as a general rule. You always find some that are okay with it, but law schools really prefer you to just wait until you're ready to go. So, it can be done, but I wouldn't apply with the knowing that you're going to defer, because you may very well be admitted to schools that won't allow it, or just won't hold your spot. Okay, sorry, I just saw some more questions pop up. How many law schools should you apply to, and do other schools see? Other schools do not see. How many you should apply to really varies, because, I have some students who are like, I'm going to apply to the top, T12, or they just want to apply to the top 5 school. And if I don't get into one of those schools, I'm just not going to law school. Which is, what you don't need to have safeties like you do for undergrad, right? Because you could just not go. Other students are very, my significant other has a job in New York, so I'm going to apply to every law school in New York, and that's it. If I don't get into school in New York, I'm not going this year. And then there are others who are like, I want merit money, and I want to maximize my chances of getting merit money, and therefore I'm going to apply to a very large number of schools. So it really varies on your particular strategy. So I have students who apply to 3, and I have students who apply to 20. Those are extremes on either end. Are reapplications allowed if you get rejected? They are, and there's a question on the application, of course, and like they will have access to your former file. So it's usually only worthwhile if you have something very new, if you took the Lsat again, or if you worked at a really cool job for the, like there's got to be something new in your application, or it's not likely going to be successful. But I have seen students reapply and get into places.
I have a question that
After they have gone through the first process, but sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry about that. It's a very specific question, so if you don't know the answer, it's completely fine. But I was wondering if you had an idea, like if you had to quantify it through a statistic, how common interviews are among schools.
Well, as someone mentioned, at the top schools, I would say it's probably like half or maybe even more. But then if you widen it out to the top 100 schools, it gets a lot lower.
When you say top schools, do you mean top 50 or top 20?
Top 20.
20, okay.
I'm arbitrarily picking a number. But it does become less common the lower down you go. But again, those are the places where I think you can sort of not create your own interview, but reach out to admissions and have a conversation with them that kind of serves the same purpose. Is retaking the Lsat worth it? If you do better, that's I have this conversation a lot, and it depends. You got to weigh sort of what would you need to do to really be prepared, and what are the chances that you're going to do better. The law schools are going to see both scores, but if you can do better, and then also the timing. Like sometimes I'll have students who say, well, is it better to get my application in early, or should I wait and take the Lsat again? It may go up, but then my application is much later in the cycle. So there's a lot of factors that go into that determination. But if you know you're going to get higher, then yes. All right. Anything else on anybody's mind? Okay. Well, it was nice.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Laura.
Sure. It was good to see you all again. And, Sarah, you have if anybody thinks of any follow-up questions, I assume you have my contact info. Well, I know you do, Sarah.
Yes. Thank you so much.